Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 8, Day 6. Today's journal, I'd like for you to tell me in a couple of sentences your understanding of imperialism and annexation of countries, and give an example of two that we have talked about or that you can think of just from American history or your brief knowledge. If you don't know any, go take a quick moment and Google a few countries that we have annexed, or try to Google any countries that we've been involved in a imperialistic nature. Now, today we're going to be talking about the Spanish-American War, and we're going to be talking specifically about imperialism and America's influence across the globe. Now, our essential question, what was the major impact on the United States from the conflict with Spain? So, obviously, we're talking about the Spanish-American War. We're going to be dealing with Spain. Now, some problems that existed in Latin America. The U.S. was highly involved in three conflicts prior to the Spanish-American War. And the first one was the U.S. had forced Chile to pay $75,000 to families of U.S. sailors who'd been killed, injured by a mob on shore while leaving Valparaiso. The second was President Cleveland had protected U.S. shipping in Brazil after there had been a rebellion that tried to attack U.S. ships. And then July 1895, hostilities over Venezuela intensified, and Great Britain was still highly involved in Venezuela, and the U.S. came out and said that the Monroe Doctrine still applied here. And if we could step all the way back into Unit 2 of American history that we studied, really Unit 3, the Monroe Doctrine said that there could be no further colonization by European nations in the Western Hemisphere, and that the U.S. was the protector of these areas. So in this case, that's the doctrine that the U.S. tried to apply here. Great Britain made some threats, but after about 2 years, they finally backed away and stopped trying to push the issue. Now, after the events between the U.S. and Great Britain, many people in the United States who were expansionist eyed Cuba. They had seen much of the harsh realities going on in Cuba during this time, which is that they were a little bit in disarray, and that they had had a lot of rebellion. And Spain had been able to quell rebellion in Cuba for after 1878. And the Cubans were very much against Spanish rule in the country. They thought it was very oppressive. And so in 1895, 17 years later, the Cuban economy collapses, and once again the Cubans are trying to rebel against Spain. And so Spain decides that they're going to, exert their control, and they're going to really put down the hammer in Cuba. And they send over this general Valeriano Weyler, and when he comes in, he is this just hard-nosed, he's a butcher. He's going to kill whoever he has to kill. He's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that, Cuba does exactly what Spain's asking. Now, once again, we get back to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine and the U.S. being, quote unquote, the protector of the Western Hemisphere. Cuban exiles, led by journalist Jose Marti, urged the United States to try to intervene, and President Cleveland and McKinley would not intervene for fear of the expense. So you have two presidents here, both of which are not willing to get involved because they're afraid of getting into an expensive war. They don't want all-out war with Spain. They don't want a global war, so they're trying to avoid getting involved here. Now, the Cuban Rebellion continues to grow, and along with that come two writers, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, who both wrote about the Cuban Rebellion, and both of them vied with one another to try to publish these horrifying stories of the quote-unquote butcher, Weyler, and his barbed wire concentration camps for the Cuban citizens. And what they took part in was what we talked about the other day with newspapers, is yellow journalism. So they're writing these sensationalized stories about what's going on in Cuba, hoping to encourage some national spirit in our country or in the United States that would get involved in the situation. We also have the term jingoism that we learned today. That's a new vocab word for you, which is just meaning an intense burst of national pride and having the desire for an aggressive foreign policy. And what that means is that having a form of jingoism means that you want to aggressively protect other nations, and you want to be highly involved versus, United States up until really about World War II, we were an isolationist nation, all right? And we have talked a lot about that, but we pretty much isolated ourselves from the rest of the world on a global stage, at least, for a long time. A Hungarian-born journalist, Joseph Pulitzer, helped establish the modern newspaper, and he's also famous for his establishment of the Pulitzer Prize Awards, which have been awarded since 1917. So if you've ever heard of the Pulitzer Prize, there you go. Now, pressure begins to build for the United States to get involved in Cuba, and in 1898 there are riots erupting in Havana, and President McKinley is going to send the USS Maine along with U.S. troops on board to help in Havana Harbor. And on February 15th, 1898, there's this explosion that takes place on the USS Maine, and it kills 250 American soldiers. You know, it's this awful event, and it gets blamed entirely on the Spanish, despite the fact that most likely it was American cause. Something went wrong in the ammunition hold and it just blew up. But it's blamed on the Spanish military and that it was sabotage. And the idea here was that the United States had eyed the Philippines for a long period of time. And I know you're like, well, where are the Philippines coming into all this? Well, the Spanish controlled not only Cuba but also the Philippines. And by gaining control of one, you would be able to effectively maybe push out Spain in the other. And Secretary of the Navy at the time, future President Teddy Roosevelt, is going to be very, very influential in trying to push for this, along with the president himself. Now, Roosevelt recalls the Navy per the president's orders, all except for Admiral George Dewey and his group of ships. And Dewey is told explicitly to attack the Spanish fleet in the event that there is an attack in Cuba. And so, you know, George Dewey's there, he's waiting for orders, and these demands are sent to Spain of what's going to happen, because in America, back in the United States, you've got people, you know, crying, you know, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And that is the phrase that is going through all of America during this time. And so the United States demands from Spain, hey, we want compensation for the Maine, so we want money for the ship that you destroyed, even though, quote unquote, they destroyed, in the concentration camps in Cuba, and give Cuba its independence. Now, Spain does agree to negotiate, but unfortunately McKinley cannot avoid this cry for war. And so President McKinley on April 11th died, or the phrase "remember the Maine" comes out, and Dewey, still being stationed in the Philippines, 3 weeks later will launch an attack, destroying the entire Spanish fleet in just 7 hours. While that's taking place, you have Teddy Roosevelt, who is now joined up with a group of volunteers called the Rough Riders, and he is leading them, and they're going to take their most famous battle being up San Juan Hill in Cuba, and they're going to take a deciding victory over the Spanish. Now, the important part here with this Rough Riders and all of this going on is that the Spanish were not successful in any way against the American military, but as you're going to see here in a second, what killed the American military was more of just the environment of Cuba. Now, we also saw the quote-unquote Negro cavalry during this time who fought alongside the Rough Riders, and it is said without the Negro cavalry that the Rough Riders would have been destroyed. And just goes to show you that African Americans who have been freed from slavery, who are trying to find their place in society, are also trying to be participants in the American lifestyle and protecting the nation and being a part of the country as regular citizens. But obviously, we've still talked about some of those racial issues going on in our country. Now, at the end of the war, very, very short war. So, April 11th, we have Remember the Maine. May 1st, we have the entire Spanish fleet destroyed in the Philippines. And then July 3rd, the Spanish fleet's trying to flee and leave the harbor. And when they do, the U.S. sinks every Spanish ship. And with that comes this huge, wild Independence Day celebration in America, because it's like we've defeated the Spanish, even though obviously it wasn't their entire military, it was just the contingency that was here. 2,500 Americans had died in the short war, so just in 2 short months, but only about 400 actually died from battle. The rest died from food poisoning, yellow fever, malaria, and just inadequate medical care. John Hay, who was the future Secretary of State, wrote Roosevelt that it had been a splendid little war. Now, the treaty with Spain comes after the war's over, and we essentially paid $20 million to Spain as part of the treaty, and they gave up the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and the Pacific island of Guam to the United States. And the new islands were not states as set by the government, but the U.S. had colonial power over these states, despite the fact that it does go against the right to liberty. So you have this huge debate of, well, instituting them as colonial, societies, but yet we said that was wrong for European nations to do. How can we do it? And it gets back to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine: are we the protector or are we the ruler, quote unquote? After heated debate, the U.S. ratifies a treaty in February 1899 known as the Teller Amendment, saying that the U.S. could not annex Cuba to be a part of its society, and it will be its own free territory, okay, or its own free country. Now, the Pacific island of Guam, Puerto Rico, a little different story, but we're not going to get into that today. Now, in the Philippines, we have a completely different situation. You have the Filipinos trying to fight back because obviously the Spanish have been there. Now the U.S. is trying to come in and take over the country as well. Rebel leader Emilio Aguinaldo is going to issue a proclamation in 1899 declaring the Philippines as a republic. And he was just the leader of the rebels who was saying the United States could not come in here and take us. We're just like any other country, and we're going to declare our independence. The U.S. ignored this, and mounting tensions led to a 3-year war that over 4,200 Americans were killed and 2,800 more were wounded. And the Americans fought recklessly and without restraint and killed over 16,000 Filipino rebels and thousands more civilians. So a very, very high ratio of death there. You think in a 3-year war, that's a lot of fighting going on. It's one of those wars we don't really talk about a lot. But the Philippines will not receive their full independence until 1946 at the end of World War II. Now, our other involvement in everything we're talking about today is showing our imperialistic nature as a country. We tried to annex Hawaii. In 1887, Hawaii began leasing. Hawaii leased out Pearl Harbor for the U.S. ships, and the Navy was able to go there and use as a port, etc. And that same year, white Hawaiian-born planters forced Hawaiian King Kalakaua to accept a new constitution, giving them control of the government. And then when he left the throne, Queen Liliuokalani, she took the throne after Kalakaua's death, and she was a nationalist, meaning that she supported Hawaii as its own nation and was very much opposed to U.S. control. And so with the help of the U.S. Marines, pineapple planter Sanford B. Dole actually removed the Queen, and by 1898, Hawaii was annexed and brought in as part of the United States, at least as a territory. So anytime you've ever eaten anything from the Dole plantation or that a Dole product, which I'm sure you've all seen, this is what they were involved in to establish their company prior to its inception as a full-on corporation. Just interesting, and I think if you looked up the background of a lot of these companies where they got started, a lot of them were built on some pretty bad stuff, truthfully. Oil industry. That was pineapples or fruit companies. I mean, think about the United Fruit Company we talked about the other day. But anyways, I digress, and I want to let you get done with this. No questions today. Just make sure you get done with your vocabulary. There's 4 words here: Valeriano Valer, Jingoism, Rough Riders, and Sanford B. Dole. That's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.